It was one of those Los Angeles nights where the air felt still, like the whole city was holding its breath. Up in the hills of Beverly Hills, where the streets twist like lazy snakes and the houses hide behind tall hedges and iron gates, everything looked peaceful. Palm trees swayed just enough to make a soft rustling sound, and the only lights came from the occasional porch or the distant glow of downtown far below. But peace can be deceiving. Down in a cramped apartment off Sunset Boulevard, 3 guys huddled around a laptop, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and nerves. They weren't hardened criminals, more like guys who'd made a string of bad choices and were now looking for a quick way out. One had lost his job at a car wash after the owner caught him skimming tips. Another had racked up debts he couldn't pay after a string of unlucky bets. The third just wanted to prove he wasn't a loser, even if it meant doing something stupid. They'd been talking about one big score for weeks, half joking at first, then more seriously as their bank accounts got emptier and their options fewer. They started watching videos online, home tours of celebrity mansions, drone footage of gated communities, even clips from reality shows where stars showed off their walk-in closets and wine cellars. That's how Jimmy Kimmel's house came up. They saw a clip from his show where he joked about living in a normal house, not one of those spaceship mansions. He made it sound humble. They took that to mean easy. "He's always on TV laughing," one of them said, scrolling through old Instagram posts. "He's probably the kind of guy who leaves his windows open and forgets to lock the back door." Another nodded. "Yeah, and he's always talking about how much he loves his neighbors. Bet he doesn't even have one of those fancy alarm systems." They didn't know much about security, just what they'd seen in movies. They figured if they moved fast and stayed quiet, they could slip in, grab whatever looked valuable, and be gone before anyone noticed. Cash, watches, maybe some signed memorabilia they could sell online. They didn't plan to hurt anyone. In their minds, this wasn't violent. It was just borrowing from someone who had way more than they'd ever need. For days, they watched. They drove past Kimmel Street slowly, pretending to be lost tourists. They noted when the trash bins came out, when the gardener showed up, when lights turned on or off. They saw a delivery van drop off groceries one afternoon and figured that meant someone was home. But then they noticed the same van came every Tuesday, even when Kimmel was filming in Burbank. That gave them an idea. If he was taping his show, he probably wasn't sleeping at home. They checked his schedule online. Sure enough, he was scheduled to tape all week. Perfect. They didn't think about the cameras. Not really. They assumed if there were any, they'd be fake. Those black dome things people put up just to scare off trouble. They didn't consider motion sensors, pressure pads under rugs, or glass that could feel when it was broken. They certainly didn't know that after a break-in attempt at a neighbor's house 2 years earlier, Kimmel had quietly upgraded his entire security setup, with help from a former Secret Service agent who specialized in protecting entertainers. All they saw was opportunity. They bought cheap gloves at a hardware store, a pair of bolt cutters from an online marketplace, and a backpack big enough to hold a few good things. They practiced climbing over fences in a nearby park after dark, laughing nervously when one of them slipped and scraped his knee. It felt like a game until it didn't. The night they chose was cool and dry with no moon, good for staying hidden. They parked 3 blocks away and walked the rest, keeping to the shadows, hearts pounding louder than their footsteps. One carried the bolt cutters. Another had a small crowbar. The third just kept whispering, "We got this. We got this," like a prayer. As they neared the property, they saw what looked like a regular wall, stone and stucco, about 8 feet high, with some ivy growing up the side. No obvious cameras, no blinking lights, just a quiet, expensive-looking house nestled among trees. A few lights were on inside, but that didn't worry them. Rich people left lights on all the time, they figured. Made the place look lived in. They waited 10 minutes, watching for cars, for dogs, for anything that might ruin their plan. Nothing moved. The street was empty. Even the crickets seemed to have gone quiet. "Now or never," one whispered. They tossed a rope with a small weight over the top of the wall, pulled it tight, and started climbing. It was harder than they expected. The ivy was slick and the stone was rough against their palms. But they made it over, dropping softly onto the other side. For a second they just stood there, breathing hard, listening. All they heard was the distant hum of the city and the soft rustle of leaves. They crept toward the back of the house, where they'd seen a sliding glass door in one of the online videos. Their plan was simple. Cut the lock, slide it open, get in fast, grab what they could, and leave through the same way. 10 minutes tops. What they didn't know was that the moment their feet touched the grass inside the property line, a silent signal had already been sent. Not to a loud alarm that would scare them off, but to a monitoring center downtown, where a security specialist saw 3 heat signatures appear on a digital map of the estate. At the same time, a notification popped up on Jimmy Kimmel's phone, even though he was miles away sitting in his dressing room between comedy sketches. But the thieves didn't see any of that. They only saw the back patio, the dark windows, and what they thought was their chance. One of them pulled out the bolt cutters and went to work on the padlock securing the gate to the backyard. It took longer than expected. The metal was tougher than it looked. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His hands shook. But finally, with a sharp snap, the lock gave way. They exchanged quick, nervous grins. This was it. They moved to the sliding door. It looked old. Aluminum frame, foggy glass, perfect. The crowbar slid in easily between the door and the frame. With a soft grunt, they pried it open just enough to slip a thin tool inside and flip the latch. The door clicked open. No alarm. No shouting. No dogs barking. They stepped inside, and that's when everything changed. The hallway was dimly lit by a nightlight shaped like a star, something Kimmel's kids probably used. It cast long shadows on the hardwood floor. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. It felt normal, too normal, like any family home. But then, from somewhere deep in the walls, a calm, recorded voice spoke. "You are being recorded. Please leave the premises immediately." They froze. Their blood turned cold. They looked at each other, eyes wide. No one moved. No one breathed. The voice didn't yell. It didn't threaten. It just repeated softly but firmly. "You are being recorded. Please leave the premises immediately." One of them took a step back toward the door, but before he could reach it, bright white lights flooded the backyard, so intense they could see them even through the closed curtains. Then came the sound, distant but unmistakable. Sirens. Not one, several, getting closer. Fast. That's when the panic really set in. Their easy score had turned into a trap and they hadn't even taken a single thing, but it was too late to run. The house, which had seemed so quiet and inviting just minutes before, now felt like a cage. And they were already inside. Outside, tires screeched to a halt at the end of the driveway. Radios crackled. Voices gave sharp commands. They stood in the hallway, hearts hammering, realizing with sickening clarity that they'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. They'd picked the wrong house, and Jimmy Kimmel, funny, friendly, seemingly easygoing Jimmy Kimmel, had defenses they never could have imagined. In that moment, all they wanted was to go back to that cramped apartment, to that stupid laptop, to the life where their biggest problem was rent. But there was no going back now. The night had only just begun, and their regret had already started to sink in, deep and heavy like a stone in their stomachs. The moment those bright lights hit the backyard, everything inside the house seemed to shift. It wasn't just light, it was like the whole property had woken up. The calm, sleepy feeling vanished, replaced by something sharp and alert, like the house itself had turned against them. One of them stumbled backward, knocking over a small side table with a ceramic lamp. It didn't shatter, just tipped over with a dull thud. But the sound felt huge in the silence that followed. Then came the voice again, calm but firmer this time. "You are trespassing. Exit the premises now or law enforcement will be notified." They all froze. One of them whispered, "But they're already coming." "We heard sirens, exactly." That's when it hit them. The voice wasn't a warning. It was a message that had already been sent. The system wasn't asking. It was telling them they'd been caught. Panic set in fast. One bolted for the sliding door they'd just come through, yanking at the handle. But it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside now, automatically, silently, without anyone touching it. He pulled harder, shoulders hunched, breath coming in short gasps. Nothing. Another tried a nearby window. Same thing. Locked tight. He pounded on the glass with his fist, but it didn't even rattle. It was thick, reinforced, nothing like the flimsy windows in the apartments they were used to. The third just stood in the middle of the hallway, staring at the ceiling like he expected it to open up and swallow him whole. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the crowbar. It clattered on the floor, echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. Outside, the sirens were closer now, so close they could hear the crunch of tires on gravel, the sharp bark of police radios. Red and blue lights flashed through the curtains, painting the walls in streaks of color that pulsed like a warning heartbeat. They needed a plan. Fast. One pointed toward the front of the house. Maybe the front door's still open? They ran, quietly at first, then less so as fear took over. Their shoes slapped against the hardwood floor, and every creak of a floorboard sounded like a betrayal. They passed a living room filled with cozy furniture, family photos on the walls, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. It looked like a real home, not some fortress. That made it worse. They weren't breaking into a cold, empty mansion. They were in someone's actual life. They reached the front entryway. A grand door with stained glass panels, beautiful. And locked. Not just locked, sealed. A soft click sound came from the walls as heavy bolts slid into place from inside the frame. They hadn't even touched the handle. "What is this?" one hissed, pulling at the door with both hands. "It's like the house is alive." In a way, it was. What they didn't know was that the moment they'd crossed the property line, the security system had gone into lockdown mode. Windows sealed. Doors dead-bolted remotely. Interior zones isolated. Even the garage door had lowered automatically, cutting off another possible escape. The house wasn't just watching, it was trapping, and it wasn't done. Overhead, tiny vents near the ceiling hissed softly. At first, they thought it was the AC kicking on, but then the air changed, sharp, stinging. One of them coughed. Then another. Within seconds, their eyes started watering. Their throats burned. It wasn't tear gas, not the kind used by police, but a non-lethal deterrent mist designed to disorient and flush out intruders without causing lasting harm. Safe, legal, and incredibly effective. Get out! Get out! One choked, doubling over, but there was nowhere to go. They stumbled into a nearby bathroom, slamming the door behind them, gasping for clean air. The mist didn't follow. It was only in the main living zones, but their eyes were red, their noses running. One leaned against the sink, trying to catch his breath, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked terrified, younger than he felt, like a kid who'd wandered into a nightmare. Outside, voices grew louder. "Police, stay where you are!" Flashlights swept across the windows. Boots crunched on the driveway. A dog barked, deep, commanding. A K-9 unit, one of them whispered, "We didn't even take anything." That was the worst part. They hadn't stolen a single thing. No cash, no jewelry, not even a souvenir pen from the desk. And yet they were already guilty. Already trapped. Already facing consequences far bigger than they'd imagined. Back at the ABC studio, Jimmy Kimmel was sitting in his dressing room, still in his suit from the taping. His phone buzzed again. A second alert. Intruders contained in West Wing. Law enforcement en route. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and called his head of security, a former Marine who now ran his home protection detail. "Yeah, I saw it," the security lead said calmly. "They're boxed in. BHPD is 2 minutes out. We've got drone coverage, thermal imaging, and full audio. They're not going anywhere." Kimmel didn't sound angry, just tired. "Just make sure no one gets hurt," he said. "And tell the cops to check if they're kids. They probably don't know what they're doing." Meanwhile, inside the house, the three were huddled in the bathroom, trying to decide what to do. One wanted to surrender. Another wanted to hide in a closet and hope they'd be missed. The third just kept saying, "This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to happen," over and over like a broken record. Then came a new sound, low, mechanical, almost like a hum. From the hallway, a small device rolled into view. It looked like a robot vacuum, but with a camera on top and a speaker on the side. It stopped right outside the bathroom door. A voice came through it, real this time, not recorded. "Calm, professional. This is the Beverly Hills Police Department. Come out with your hands up. You are surrounded. No one needs to get hurt." They looked at each other. No more running. No more hiding. The game was over. One took a deep breath, wiped his eyes, and turned the doorknob. As he stepped into the hallway, hands raised above his head, the lights brightened automatically. Cameras swiveled to follow him. Officers appeared at both ends of the corridor, rifles lowered but ready, K-9 at their side, ears perked, eyes locked on the intruders. On your knees. Now, an officer commanded. They dropped without argument. Hands behind their heads, faces to the floor. Within minutes, they were zip-tied, searched, and led outside into the cool night air. The flashing lights were blinding. Neighbors had come out onto their porches wrapped in robes, watching in silence. Some held phones recording. Others just stared wide-eyed. One officer read them their rights while another checked their pockets. All they found were gloves, a flashlight, and the bolt cutters, still clutched in one guy's hand like he'd forgotten to drop it. At the station, things moved fast. Detectives pulled up footage from the house's cameras. Clear, high-definition video of every step they'd taken, every mistake they'd made. There was no denying it, no alibi, no excuse. During questioning, one finally broke down. We thought it'd be easy. He's always on TV laughing. We figured he wouldn't have all this stuff. The detective leaned forward, not angry, just serious. You picked the wrong guy. He's got kids. He's had threats before. And yeah, he's nice on TV. But nice doesn't mean careless. Back at the mansion, cleanup crews arrived. The mist was ventilated. The locks reset. The system returned to standby. By morning, the house looked exactly as it had the night before. Peaceful, quiet, untouched. But for the three who'd tried to break in, everything had changed. In less than 20 minutes, their quick score had turned into felony charges, mugshots, and a future they couldn't take back, and all because they mistook kindness for weakness. Outside, the city kept humming. The sun would rise soon, birds would start singing, and Jimmy Kimmel would go on TV, tell a few jokes, and never mention a word about the night his house caught thieves who thought stealing from a comedian would be the easiest job they'd ever do. But those thieves, they'd remember every second, every light, every voice from the walls. They'd walked in thinking they were smart. They walked out knowing they'd been fools. And the regret? That would stick with them longer than any jail sentence ever could. The interrogation room smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner, sharp, stale, and a little sad. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat gray glow on the metal table and the two chairs bolted to the floor. One of the guys sat with his head down, elbows on the table, fingers laced together like he was praying. Another leaned against the wall, eyes darting to the one-way mirror, wondering who was watching. The third just stared at his hands, still red from the zip ties the cops had used. A detective walked in, not in a rush, not angry, just calm, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. He set a paper cup of water on the table and sat across from them. No file, no shouting, just quiet. You want to tell me why you picked that house? He asked, voice low. They exchanged glances. No one spoke at first. Then the one by the wall mumbled, "We didn't think it'd be like that." Like what? Like full of traps, like it knew we were coming. The detective almost smiled. Not a mean smile, more like someone who'd heard that before. "It's not a trap," he said. "It's just smart. You don't live in that neighborhood without knowing someone's always watching." And Jimmy Kimmel? He's been around a long time. He's got friends in places you wouldn't believe. They didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But as the night wore on, the pieces started to fall into place. The detective didn't yell. He just showed them things. First, a tablet with footage from the house's cameras, clear as day even in the dark. There they were, climbing the wall like kids sneaking into a pool after hours. There they were, fumbling with the lock, whispering to each other, looking around like they owned the place. And then, the moment the door opened, the exact second the system flagged them as intruders. See this? The detective pointed to a small red dot on the screen. That's not a camera. That's a thermal sensor. It reads body heat. The second you step past the garden hedge, it logged your location, your size, your movement pattern, sent it straight to a security center downtown and to his phone. One of them swallowed hard. He knew we were there. While he was on TV? Yep. He watched you walk through his hallway from his dressing room. Called his security team before you even touched the sliding door. That hit them harder than any handcuff ever could. They hadn't just been caught. They'd been watched, studied, allowed to walk right into a box with no way out. And the whole time, the man they were trying to rob was miles away, getting ready to tell jokes to millions of people. The detective leaned back. You think rich people are careless, lazy? That they leave doors unlocked because they're nice? Nah. The ones who last, the ones who stay safe, they plan. They pay attention. and they don't take chances. He paused, then added, especially not when they've got kids. That last part landed like a stone. They hadn't thought about kids. They'd seen toys in the yard once, but figured they were for guests or something. They didn't connect it. But now, sitting in that cold room, they pictured a family, maybe eating dinner, maybe reading bedtime stories, and realized they hadn't just trespassed. They'd invaded a home. The weight of it pressed down on them, heavier than fear. Back at the mansion, cleanup was already done. A technician walked through each room, checking sensors, resetting locks, running diagnostics on the system. Everything had worked perfectly, better than expected. The non-lethal deterrent had cleared the main zones without damage. The K-9 unit never even needed to enter. The suspects surrendered before things escalated. No property was stolen. No one was hurt. The head of security called Jimmy early the next morning. "All clear," he said. "System performed flawlessly. Cops have them in custody. Full video evidence," Jimmy just sighed. "Good, I hope they learned something." He didn't gloat. Didn't post about it online. Didn't even mention it to his crew. To him, it wasn't a story, it was a reminder. A few years back, a neighbor's house had been broken into during the night. The family was home. The thieves took jewelry, electronics, even the kids' piggy banks. No one was hurt, but the feeling of safety was gone. That's when Jimmy upgraded everything, not for show, but for peace of mind. Now, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the hills gold, he thought about those three guys. He didn't hate them. He felt sorry for them. They were desperate, maybe dumb, but not evil, and that made it sadder. Meanwhile, at the police station, the reality of what they'd done started to sink in. A public defender came in, explained the charges: residential burglary, that's a felony; conspiracy, possession of burglary tools; even attempted theft, even though they hadn't taken anything. Under California law, just entering with intent was enough. "You're looking at serious time," the lawyer said gently. "But if you cooperate, show remorse, maybe we can work out a deal." One of them asked, "Will he press charges?" The lawyer hesitated. "He hasn't said yet. But honestly, with the evidence we have, it doesn't matter. The state will prosecute regardless." Still, they held out hope. Maybe the guy on TV, the one who made people laugh every night, would let it go. Maybe he'd say, "They didn't take anything, just scare them straight." But hope doesn't change facts. Later that day, detectives brought in more evidence. Not just video, audio too. Every word they'd whispered in the hallway, every panicked breath. Even the moment one said, "This wasn't supposed to happen." It was all there, crystal clear. And then came the drone footage. Shot from above as police surrounded the house. Showed them pacing like caged animals, trying doors, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. To the detectives, it was routine. To them, it felt like watching their own downfall in slow motion. One broke down crying. Not loud, just quiet tears, shoulders shaking. "I just wanted to pay my mom's rent," he whispered. "She's sick. I didn't know what else to do." The detective didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he slid a tissue across the table. "There's always another way," he said softly. "Breaking into someone's home, isn't it?" That night, alone in a holding cell, they couldn't sleep. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw those lights flooding the backyard. Heard that calm voice from the walls. Felt the sting in their eyes. They kept replaying it. What if they'd turned back at the wall? What if they'd believed the rumors about celebrity security? What if they'd just gotten a second job, swallowed their pride, asked for help? But what if doesn't fix anything. Back in Beverly Hills, life went on. Gardeners trimmed hedges. Mail carriers dropped off packages. Kids rode bikes down quiet streets. And Jimmy Kimmel went back to work, told jokes, made people laugh. But something had shifted, not in the neighborhood, but in the minds of three young men who thought crime was a shortcut. Now they knew. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some houses aren't just brick and glass, they're protected by layers of care, planning, and the quiet strength of someone who's learned the hard way that kindness doesn't mean being soft. And the worst part? They hadn't even needed to break in to learn that lesson. All they had to do was watch his show. Listen to how he talked about his family. Notice the way he treated his staff, his neighbors, even strangers on the street. He wasn't just a TV host. He was a person who built a life and guarded it not with anger but with wisdom. Now sitting in that cold cell, they finally understood. And the regret? It wasn't just about getting caught. It was about thinking so little of someone else's home and so little of themselves. The courtroom was smaller than they expected. Not like on TV with high ceilings and dramatic echoes. This one felt tight, almost ordinary. Wood-paneled walls, scuffed floors, a clock ticking too loudly above the judge's bench. They sat side by side in stiff chairs, dressed in clothes their families had brought. Clean jeans, plain shirts, no logos. No chains, no orange jumpsuits. The judge had allowed that much dignity at least. Their lawyer sat beside them, calm and steady, flipping through papers like this was just another Tuesday. Maybe for him it was, but for them it was the day everything got real. The prosecutor stood first. She didn't raise her voice, didn't glare. She just laid out the facts one after another like stacking bricks. Surveillance footage, audio logs, police reports, drone recordings, even the time-stamped alert that went to Jimmy Kimmel's phone the moment they crossed the property line. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse, it was undeniable. Then came the security expert. A quiet man in a dark suit who spoke in simple terms anyone could understand. He explained how the system worked, not to impress but to clarify. Motion sensors in the garden, pressure-sensitive flooring near entry points, glass break detectors on every window, and the lockdown protocol. Once triggered, the house sealed itself like a vault. No human had to press a button. It just happened. Was anyone inside the home at the time? The prosecutor asked. No, the expert replied. Mr. Kimmel was at his studio taping his show, but the system doesn't need him to be present. It's designed to protect the home whether someone's there or not. That hit hard. They hadn't just invaded an empty house. They'd broken into a space that was still, in every meaningful way, someone's sanctuary, a place where kids left drawings on the fridge, where family dinners happened, where laughter echoed after long days, and it had defended itself calmly, efficiently, without rage or revenge. Their lawyer stood next. He didn't deny what happened. Instead, he asked the judge to consider who they were. Not career criminals, not violent offenders, just young men who'd made a terrible, impulsive choice. He mentioned one had been working 2 jobs before his hours got cut. Another was trying to help a sick relative. The third had never been in trouble before, not even a parking ticket. He thought it would be easy, the lawyer said, voice low. He thought a man who makes people laugh for a living wouldn't take security seriously. That was his mistake, but it wasn't born out of malice. It was born out of ignorance and desperation. The judge listened, didn't interrupt, didn't frown, just took notes, eyes thoughtful behind thin glasses. Then came the moment they'd been dreading and secretly hoping for. The prosecutor said, Your Honor, Mr. Kimmel has submitted a statement. He's chosen not to appear in person, but he wanted the court to hear his perspective. She read it aloud, not long. Just a few paragraphs written in plain, honest words. I don't know these young men, it began. But I've been young. I've made mistakes. I've been foolish. What they did was wrong. Breaking into someone's home is never okay. But I don't believe they meant to hurt anyone. My family wasn't there that night, thank goodness. No one was injured. My hope is that this becomes a turning point for them, not an ending. I've asked the court to consider alternatives to prison if possible. Counseling, community service, anything that helps them rebuild rather than just punish. Because locking someone away doesn't always teach them how to do better. Sometimes it just teaches them how to survive. The room was silent when she finished. Even the clock seemed to pause. One of them wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Not sobbing, just quiet tears like relief mixed with shame. They'd expected anger, maybe even a demand for the maximum sentence. Instead, they got mercy. Not forgiveness exactly, but a chance. The judge looked at them over his glasses. Do you understand what you did? He asked, not unkindly. They nodded. Do you understand that you violated more than just property? You violated trust, safety. The basic idea that a person's home should be their refuge? Again, they nodded. One whispered, Yes, Your Honor. The judge exhaled slowly. Mr. Kimmel's words carry weight, not because he's famous, but because he chose compassion over vengeance. That doesn't erase your actions, but it does give me room to be thoughtful in my ruling. He sentenced them that day not to prison but to a strict diversion program. 2 years of probation, mandatory counseling, 300 hours of community service, split between a youth outreach center and a neighborhood watch initiative. They'd also have to pay restitution for the damage, The broken lock, the tipped-over lamp, the cost of the security response, even though it wasn't much. And if they completed everything without a single slip-up, the charges could be reduced or even dismissed. It wasn't freedom, but it was a path forward. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright. Too bright. They squinted, shielding their eyes like they'd been underground for weeks. Family members waited, mothers, brothers, and aunt holding a thermos of coffee. No grand speeches, just hugs. Carlos, I'm proud of you for facing this, and let's go home. Back in Beverly Hills, Jimmy Kimmel heard the verdict from his lawyer. He didn't celebrate, didn't post about it. He just nodded and said, "Good. I hope they use this." Later that week, he made a quiet donation, not to a security company, but to the very youth center where one of the guys would be doing his service hours. No fanfare, no press release, just a check with a note. Help kids before they think breaking in is their only option. Meanwhile, the three began their new routine. Early mornings, bus rides across town, sweeping floors, organizing donated clothes, helping run after-school programs for kids who reminded them of their younger selves, restless, unsure, looking for someone to believe in them. At first, it felt like punishment, but slowly something shifted. They started listening to the kids' stories, heard about food insecurity, unstable homes, the pressure to hustle just to get by, and they realized they hadn't been so different. Just luckier once. And then, not one afternoon while painting a mural in the center's hallway, one of them paused, brush in hand, and said out loud, "I wish someone had told me there was another way." The program director, an older man with tired eyes and a warm smile, overheard. "Now you can be that someone," he said simply. And for the first time in a long time, they felt useful. Back at the mansion, life returned to normal. The garden bloomed. The kids' bikes leaned against the garage. Jimmy came home from work, kissed his wife, asked about the kids' day. No alarms, no sirens, just peace. But the memory of that night stayed with him, not as fear, but as a reminder. He started talking more openly on his show about community, about second chances, about how easy it is to judge someone without knowing their story. Not directly about the break-in, never that, but the message was there, woven into his jokes, his interviews, his quiet moments of sincerity. And those three? They never forgot the sound of that voice from the walls, or the lights flooding the backyard, or the way mercy felt when they least deserved it. They'd gone in thinking they'd steal something valuable. Instead, they walked out with something far rarer, a chance to become better. And this time, they weren't going to waste it. Months passed, the kind of months that don't make headlines but quietly reshape lives. The hills of Beverly Hills stayed green, the palm trees kept swaying, and Jimmy Kimmel's house, once the scene of a botched break-in, returned to its rhythm of family dinners, bedtime stories, and weekend barbecues. No one driving by would ever guess what had happened there on that quiet Tuesday night, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. But for the three young men, everything had changed. Not in a flashy way, but in the small, steady choices they made every day. They showed up to their community service on time, listened more than they spoke, helped set up chairs for youth workshops, stocked shelves at the food pantry, even mentored a few teenagers who reminded them too much of their old selves, restless, lost, convinced the world had already written them off. At first, people watched them closely. Staff at the center gave them tasks but kept their distance. The kids eyed them with suspicion, but over time consistency wore down doubt. They didn't brag, didn't make excuses, just did the work. One started helping with homework after school, patiently walking a struggling student through math problems he himself had barely passed years ago. Another began sharing his story, not to gain sympathy but to say, "I was where you are. Don't make my mistake." It wasn't redemption overnight. It was showing up again and again, even when no one was watching. Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel never mentioned the incident on his show. Not once, he didn't need to. But those who knew him noticed a subtle shift, the way he lingered longer in conversations about poverty, mental health, or the justice system. The way he'd pause before making a joke about crime, as if remembering that behind every headline was a human being with a story far more complicated than thief or criminal. One evening, during a charity telethon he hosted for youth programs across Los Angeles, he said something that stuck with people. Sometimes the biggest act of courage isn't fighting back. It's choosing to change when no one expects you to. He didn't look at the camera when he said it. Just spoke it like it was something he'd been thinking about for a while. No one connected the dots. And that was fine. Back at the outreach center, the three were nearing the end of their required service hours. Their probation officer had nothing but good reports. They'd kept jobs, modest ones but steady. One worked nights at a warehouse. Another trained as a mechanic. The third enrolled in community college studying social work. They weren't rich, weren't famous, but they were building something real. One afternoon, as they helped paint a new mural on the center's exterior, bright colors, hopeful words like grow, rise, and try again, a local reporter stopped by. She was doing a piece on second chances in the justice system. She asked if they'd be willing to talk just briefly about their experience. They hesitated, then agreed, but only if their faces weren't shown and no names were used. They didn't want attention. They just wanted someone to know that people can change. "We thought breaking into that house would solve our problems," one said, voice quiet but clear. "Instead, it showed us how wrong we were. Not just about security, but about life. You don't fix desperation with crime. You fix it with help. And sometimes, you get that help from the last person you'd expect." The reporter asked if they'd ever reached out to thank Jimmy Kimmel. They hadn't, and they wouldn't. "He doesn't owe us anything," another said. "He didn't have to ask the judge for leniency. He didn't have to care. But he did. That's enough." What they didn't know was that Jimmy had been quietly following their progress, not through surveillance or private investigators, but through updates from the center's director, whom he'd come to know through his donations. He never interfered, never asked for updates directly. But when he heard one of them had helped stop a fight between two teens by talking them down instead of walking away, he smiled to himself and wrote another check. Time kept moving. Seasons changed. The case faded from court records, from news cycles, from public memory, but not from the hearts of those involved. 1 year after the break-in on a cool spring evening, Jimmy stood on his back porch, coffee in hand, watching fireflies blink in the garden. His youngest child ran past, chasing a glow stick, laughing. The house was quiet, safe, whole. He thought about that night, not with fear, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Because it reminded him that kindness isn't weakness, that protecting what you love doesn't mean shutting out the world. It means understanding it, even its broken parts, and maybe, just maybe, offering a hand instead of a hammer. For the three young men, life wasn't perfect. There were still bills, bad days, moments of doubt, but they carried a new kind of pride, the kind that comes from earning your place back, not demanding it. They'd learned that real strength isn't in taking, it's in rebuilding, in showing up, in choosing every single day to be better than your worst moment. They never returned to that neighborhood, never drove past the house, but sometimes late at night one would think about those blinding lights, that calm voice from the walls, and the way everything had unraveled in minutes. And instead of shame, he'd feel something else. Clarity. Because that night didn't ruin their lives. It reset them, and in a world that often writes people off after one mistake, that second chance, quiet, unearned, undeserved, was the most valuable thing they'd ever been given. Years later, one of them would become a counselor at that same youth center, helping kids navigate the same traps he'd fallen into. Another would start a small nonprofit that taught job skills to at-risk teens. The third would graduate college and speak at schools about the cost of poor choices and the power of compassion. None of it made the news. None of it went viral, but it mattered, deeply. As for Jimmy Kimmel, he kept doing what he'd always done, making people laugh, speaking up for causes he believed in, coming home to his family every night. But now, when he walked through his front door, he didn't just feel safe, he felt hopeful, because he'd seen proof that even in the darkest choices, there's room for light if someone's willing to leave the door open, not the front door, not the back door, but the door to a better path. And sometimes all it takes is one person choosing not to slam it shut. Life has a funny way of circling back, not with fanfare, but with quiet echoes. 2 years after that night in Beverly Hills, no one talked about the break-in anymore. It had faded into the kind of story people half remember. Wasn't there something about Jimmy Kimmel's house? Yeah, I think so. But nothing happened, right? And that was true in a way. Nothing violent. Nothing tragic. But something real had happened. Something that rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The three young men had long since finished their community service. Their records weren't wiped clean. Life doesn't work like that, but they'd done everything asked of them and more. One now worked full-time at the youth center, not as a volunteer, but as a program coordinator. He helped design workshops on decision-making, peer pressure, and how to ask for help when you're drowning in silence. Kids trusted him because he didn't preach. He just listened, and when he spoke, they knew he'd been where they were. Another had become a certified auto technician. He fixed cars for single moms in his neighborhood at cost, sometimes for free if they were struggling. He kept a small notebook in his shop where people could write down what they owed. No due dates, no interest. Pay when you can, he'd say. Just keep your kids safe in a working car. The third had graduated with an associate's degree and started mentoring high school students applying to college. He helped them write essays, fill out forms, even practice interviews. He told them, don't let your past define your future. You get to rewrite it every single day. None of them ever mentioned the mansion. Not to the kids, not to coworkers, not even to each other unless it was late, and they were sitting on a porch somewhere, sharing a quiet moment. But they carried it with them, not as a scar, but as a compass. A reminder of how close they'd come to derailing their lives, and how one act of unexpected grace had pulled them back. Jimmy Kimmel, for his part, never sought credit. He didn't tweet about forgiving criminals or pose for photos with reformed thieves. That wasn't the point. To him, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human. He'd seen enough in his years, on the streets of Vegas and comedy clubs in the glare of fame, to know that most people aren't born bad. They just get lost. And sometimes all it takes is someone refusing to treat them like they're beyond saving. He did, however, start something small. Quietly through his foundation, he began funding second chance grants, and not huge sums, but enough to help local organizations expand counseling, job training, and outreach for young adults entangled in the justice system. The application process was simple. No fancy proposals. Just, what do your people need? How can we help? And every year, without fail, the youth center where those three had served received support. Not because of who they were, but because of the work they now did. One spring afternoon, the center hosted a community fair. There were food trucks, face painting, a small stage for local musicians. Jimmy Kimmel showed up, not as a celebrity, but as a donor. He wore a baseball cap, jeans, and a plain t-shirt. No security detail, just him, walking through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing with kids who had no idea who he was. He stopped by the booth where one of the three was running a life choices game, kind of like a board game where players faced real-life scenarios. Your rent is due, but your paycheck bounced. What do you do? Kids rolled dice, picked cards, talked through options. It was simple but powerful. They made eye contact, just for a second. No words, no gestures. But something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement. Respect, gratitude, understanding. Jimmy nodded slightly and moved on. Later, as he was leaving, the center's director walked him to his car. You know, she said, those three, they're why we expanded the mentorship program. They showed us that people can change if someone gives them a real shot. Jimmy smiled. They gave themselves the shot. I just didn't slam the door. He drove home as the sun dipped behind the hills. The streets were calm. His house looked just as it always had. Warm lights in the windows, a bike leaning against the garage. The faint sound of laughter from inside. That night, during his monologue, he told a joke about forgetting his keys and getting locked out of his own house. The audience laughed. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, turns out the best security system isn't cameras or alarms. It's knowing your neighbors, looking out for each other, and remembering that everyone's fighting a battle you can't see. No one in the audience connected it to anything deeper, but somewhere in the city, three young men watched the show, heard those words, and felt seen, not for what they'd done wrong, but for how far they'd come, and that was enough. Years later, when people asked Jimmy Kimmel about safety, privacy, or living in a world where anyone might try to take what's yours, he'd say the same thing. Protect your home, yes. But don't close your heart. Sometimes the people who seem like threats are just lost souls looking for a way back. The story of that night never became a movie, never trended online. But it lived, in the lives changed, in the kids guided, in the quiet choices made every day to do better. Because real life isn't about dramatic endings. It's about what happens after the sirens fade, after the cameras stop rolling, after the world moves on. And in this case, what happened next was hope. Simple, stubborn, and real.